Hi, Andrew from SACS. Welcome to video number 6 in our 6th video sequence on the psychology of power at work. And in this video, we'll be talking to you about how to avoid the negatives of power at work. And we'll look at it from a recruitment point of view and also from a promotion point of view. When you recruit somebody, it's a good idea to be aware of where the risk exists in this individual in respect of power. So if you end up promoting them or if they end up in a position of authority, what will that do to their behaviours? And we'll talk you through some psychometric markers of how all of that works. In the sequence so far, we talked about what is power, we talked about why people acquire power, we gave you some neuroscience evidence, which people are typically fascinated by. I know I am. We talked about where personality can influence the ability to acquire power, also the way that people respond to power, and we talked about values and power in the very last video. So this one is about avoiding the negatives of power at work. And so this comes down very often to a matter of recruitment and promotion. So you assess potential employees and promotees to see if they're likely to be able to cope with more power. From a psychometric assessment point of view, there are some markers of whether a person is likely to acquire more power without their behaviours becoming more negative. What you see here is a risk summary, which is an outtake from one of our psychometric assessment tools. And you'll see that there are a range of characteristics that are indicated here. Some like intelligence, which indicates high risk. So low cognitive ability is an indicator of a person's tendency to be less effective in managing higher levels of power, purely and simply because lower cognitive ability can mean that the person doesn't really see so clearly the implications of their action. And then you see personality, medium risk, values, medium risk, counterproductive work behaviours, that's high. And so counterproductive work behaviours, as I mentioned in a previous video, is the tendency to do bad stuff either to your colleagues or to the organisation. And later on in this report, we won't go through the entire report, but later on in the report, it would show you where the risk is, whether it's interpersonal or organisational or both, which would mean that the person's likely to do bad stuff to the organisation and their colleagues. You also see that there's a high risk for ethnicity, and this is what's known as attitudes towards diversity. And so this person tends to have attitudes to ethnicity which are negative, which indicates that in comparison with the average Australian, they may be a bit racist in their perspective. But let's look at some personality characteristics and draw some conclusions about whether this person is likely to cope effectively with increases in power. Now, the first thing that you see here is that this person's integrity modesty score is average, and that's not bad. I mean, this is, by the way, a thing called the SACS, which is a Hexaco personality measure validated against the Hexaco from Kibiam Lee and Mike Ashton. But the reason that this thing is called the SACS is that all of the questions in this questionnaire are work worded, and so it predicts a little bit better work-related issues. You see that this person is low in absence of greed and low in absence of arrogance. And that is a risk factor, as we demonstrated in an earlier video. When a person is arrogant, that makes it more likely that they will respond unfavourably to an increase in power. The arrogance thing says rules don't apply to me, and also it indicates a tendency to not worry so much about people's feelings or opinions or those kinds of things. You'll also see that the person is relatively modest in some aspects of conscientiousness, not very detail-minded, not very organised, but that really shouldn't be affected too much by acquiring power. However, you see this absence of anger characteristic, and this person is very low in unlikely to carry a grudge and unlikely to be harsh. And so what that means is that the person has a tendency to be a little harsh on other people and a little bit direct. Now, if the person acquires power, we know from research about people's acquiring of power that what will tend to happen is that they will tend to demonstrate those characteristics a little more anyway. But having a head start in the sense of having characteristics from a personality point of view that indicate these behaviours before they're promoted, that is a risk. And so if you're going to promote this person, two things. One, consider it in the light of this psychometric result. But secondly, what it means is that you may need to coach, guide, train, and perhaps run 360-degree feedback, and we'll talk about that in just a moment, but use those sorts of tools to, in effect, help the person to manage their behaviours and become more aware of how their behaviours might change as they acquire power. You'll also see that there's a score here on emotionality. High anxiety, I think people understand what that means. The lack of independence thing means that the person really doesn't feel that comfortable standing on their own 2 feet when it comes to decisions and those kinds of things. So the anxiety thing could contribute to the tendency to behave worse when you're in power, because of course it does raise the amount of pressure on you, because typically in organisations, power comes with authority at the same time, and that combination can be a little bit of a challenge. We also see when it comes to extroversion that this person is an extrovert, and that may mean that their tendency would be to be a bit more outgoing. Not really a risk from a power seeking or a power gaining point of view, but certainly what we see in this person's psych profiles is that there are some things which may be worth working on before the person is promoted or hired for that matter. 360-degree feedback can be really powerful. What we would suggest is that if a person is going to be promoted, it would be a really good idea to get an idea of how they are seen in a behavioural sense by their colleagues before they're promoted. We would run pre-test, do competency assessment through action learning and coaching and competency development, and then a post-test. If you're looking for the success of leadership development activities, the main way that that's done in the real world is through what I would call happy sheets. Are people satisfied with the learning and development that they've experienced? But surely the true measure of a learning and development activity that's focused on leadership is really whether the person changes their behaviours. And 360-degree feedback is a very powerful way of assessing that. Here's a description of what 360-degree feedback looks like. There are 10 characteristics that we tend to measure when we're measuring 360-degree feedback. Creates a learning environment, being supportive, causing teamwork, empowering people, creating clarity about performance standards, and then managing underperformance, creating clarity about appropriate behaviours and managing negative behaviours, celebrating success, and optimism and positivity. Measuring these things before you promote somebody gives you an indication of whether they have the behaviours that are necessary to be an effective leader before you make them such a leader. Or if they're a leader already, if they're going to take on a more responsible job. One of the things that we know is that that higher level of responsibility will place more pressure on their leadership skills. So it's a good idea to find these things out before you promote. And the model of 360-degree feedback, you have different rater cohorts. A really common combination is a self-rating, a leader rating, peers, people at similar levels of seniority, direct reports, which means people who report to this person, and indirect reports are typically people across the organisation who don't directly report to that person but may be important internal stakeholders. Typically, if you're using the 30 standard questions, we often combine custom questions in this process, and if the person is about to go through a level of promotion, then maybe the question is, do you think this person's ready for promotion? So you could rate that strongly agree to strongly disagree. And that could be a really useful additional item, which is not a standard item in our 360-degree feedback process, but could be really useful to find out. The other thing is that if you have certain competencies or certain values that the person has to live out, we can add measures for those things as well. So the process is typically you'd undertake 360-degree feedback. If they haven't been psyched in the past, you would do that at the same time. The combination, by the way, of psych testing and 360-degree feedback is particularly powerful, because when you get the 360-degree feedback results, it's amazing how often you see the reflection of the psych results in the 360-degree feedback results. Now, I've said in this video and in earlier videos that some of the things that you measure in psych testing and in 360-degree feedback are largely genetic or largely learned. And so if you know the genetic bits versus the learned bits, that can have really powerful guiding influence on the type of development that you bring this person. So if something's genetic, then your learning and development activity is about self-regulation. If on the other hand it's a skill, then of course the learning and development is about skill acquisition. Once you've psyched the person and run 360-degree feedback, you would convene a debrief meeting to debrief them on the results and to get their aspirations and also work through some development areas with them. And then you create a development plan. That development plan gives results at an individual level. And if you do enough of this within an organisation, we've often created group-based results for an entire group of leaders, or for an entire organisation. And that's incredibly powerful data at a group level. And then coaching at an individual level for the individuals, and maybe some sort of learning and development plan for the organisation. And all of that together means that the person will increase their leadership development capability. And in the case of power seeking, ensure that the person has the self-awareness necessary in order to step up to the new role without their behaviours becoming worse. And I think one of the things that can be really powerful, if you run this annually, in effect that will be an ongoing process of managing behaviours so that they are appropriate and continue to be appropriate. Now, how do you change somebody if you want them to increase their capacity to gain power without their behaviours becoming more negative? In effect, it's an exercise in self-awareness. And I think a really fascinating contributor to this is the work of Helen Rees. Helen Rees was a medical researcher, and she developed a program called Empathy, which in the first instance, one of the things that it was seeking to do is that it was seeking to cause better relationships between clinicians and their patients. And in effect, this was undertaken on a primary research kind of a basis. So the program was developed around the types of behaviours that were found to be either positive or negative in developing a relationship between a clinician and patients. So what are the behaviours that helped and what are the behaviours that hurt that relationship? And that was then subsequently built into this learning and development program, which is in many ways what we would call a micro-coaching program. So the components of it are things like eye contact. And that really says that the individual who's going through this program is trained to learn what is an appropriate amount of eye contact. I mean, if you're interacting with another person, and by the way, it was developed originally for clinicians, but now has been applied much more widely. If you're interacting with somebody, eye contact should be appropriate, not to the point where your eyes are boring into the person that you're interacting with, nor avoiding them to the point that they feel that you're trying to evade some issue or perhaps be shifty or something like that. Eye contact. Muscles of the face. And that is really two things. It's one, learning what kind of image we're manifesting with our facial expressions, but also learning the facial expressions of other people. I don't know if you know this, but there are 7 basic facial expressions for any human being on planet Earth. And if you know those 7 facial expressions and can recognize them well, you tend to have stronger relationships with other people. It's for another day for me to explain what those 7 are. But yes, 7 basic emotions that are demonstrated in facial expressions, and learning those and recognizing those and also manifesting those appropriately in return to your stakeholder can cause you to build stronger relationships. Posture. What posture is appropriate for the interaction that we're having? Am I leaning forward? Am I leaning back and looking very relaxed? Appropriate posture can be really powerful in creating the right relationships with people. We know that power seekers tend to dominate, tend to get above other people, whereas people who are power appropriate tend to be more egalitarian in their interactions with other people from a posture point of view. And also, you can mimic the posture of other people to a certain extent to build a bond with them. It's an unconscious bond, but that's often taught in things like customer service training. Affect. Affect is the degree to which you demonstrate emotion in your interactions with other people. Am I being angry? Am I being optimistic? Am I being cheerful? And managing that, and certainly a golden rule is that you're trying to give people, Gottram, a fellow by the name of Gottram, discovered that 5 positive emotions for every 1 negative emotion tended to be around about equal. In other words, people are much more sensitive to negative experiences than they are to positive experiences. So if you want people to have a good interaction with you, if you're a leader, what you're trying to do is to give your staff 7, 8, 9 positive experiences with you for every 1 negative experience with you. And that means that they will tend to be respectful, they will tend to like their interactions with you, and they'll tend to want to continue to work with you. Tone of voice. We know that people who are primed for power tend to use tones of voice which are more gruff, more assertive, more authoritative. And again, what we're seeking is egalitarianism here. You can be a boss without acting bossy, I guess is the key thing that we're talking about here. And frankly, the way that people's expectations of leadership have changed over the years, people have become far more consumeristic about leadership. I won't be led by somebody who's not respectful to me. 20, 30, 40 years ago, maybe people would do that because a person's position or power was considered to be an important thing. These days, it's nowhere near as important. Hearing the whole person is really about taking all of the issues that we've just covered, from eye contact down to tone of voice, taking all of that into account, the non-verbals, the verbals, and all of those sorts of things, and then planning your response. In other words, responding to people based on what you've taken from the verbal and from the non-verbal, and making really a planned response based on all of that. And all of that can strongly influence people's ability to build positive relationships. Now, some of these things come naturally to certain people, and you'll see that we, earlier in this video and in earlier videos in this sequence, we talked about some characteristics which will make people more skilled in doing this. Those people probably don't need quite so much coaching, or maybe even any coaching at all on these topics. Others, people who might be a little bit more naturally angry or difficult or dishonest, may well need more coaching to cause them to be more effective as they gain power, because people like that are more likely to change their behaviours due to power. That's what we had to cover on this topic. If you want to see the slides, drop us an email, make contact with us through a link near this video, and we can send those to you. And if you want to assess the products that we've mentioned in this video, like psych testing or 360-degree feedback, we're only too happy to give people a demonstration, or even in the case of psych testing, to provide free trials. Thanks for watching this video sequence. I hope it helped about how to manage power at your own workplace, and we will speak to you soon.